Now we're going to move on to the second column, the second path, which is that of unification. And the task is the second one, letting go of reactivity. And the impossible vow is that reactivity is inexhaustible, as we might have noticed over the years. But I vow to sever, cut it off like with the sword of Manjushri and not get drawn into it. But of course, if it's inexhaustible, it'll just keep on coming back. And I don't find that too hard to believe, frankly, because the reactivity, greed, hatred, delusion, all these things, they are as powerful as they are because they've been incredibly successful. They have effectively enabled human beings to evolve, or enabled through the process of evolution for our particular species to dominate, which, as we know, may not be good news for the planet, but we have managed to dominate basically because we've been very good at getting what we want, which is lobha, desire, greed. We've been very successful in getting rid of whatever stands in our way of getting what we want, starting with the Neanderthals and moving up. And also, we've been very good at getting to where we are because we've had a very strong ego, a very strong sense of me that is something permanent, and that me and mine are gonna survive to the next harvest. And that conviction of our permanence, the power to get what we want and get rid of everything that gets in the way, are effectively what we call here reactivity. The three poisons, the three fires, craving, etc. So when we say letting go of reactivity, we must be careful not to think that this is some magical Buddhist practice that will make it all go away. And this is why I think it's inexhaustible. And it's inexhaustible because it's embedded in our limbic system. I'm not a scientist, but I think I've been told this, that these primitive instincts are built into our nervous system, into our brain. And no matter how enlightened you are, you're not going to thereby somehow not have the same brain. It's going to be there. And I think it's important to accept that and to embrace that fact. We certainly can be much less driven and controlled by these instincts. We can gain a degree of independence and autonomy from them. And that is basically what letting go means. Letting go means, in a way, leaving these things be when they rise up in our minds. As I've said already, this is basically what makes mindfulness effective in therapeutic interventions. It's basically learning to stop and look and notice, let's say, chronic anxiety or whatever it might be, and rather than try to get rid of it, or rather than simply believe in it, as we usually do, and just get entangled in its power over us, we see it for what it is. We see it as basically the play of conditions coming to the surface in our own subjective experience at that moment. And we also know that if something arises, comes into being, then over time, if we leave it alone, it'll disappear. It'll fade away. It'll fizzle out by its own nature. And we, however, tend to reinforce it by identifying with it. I feel angry, I feel anxious, I feel whatever. And then we get caught up in its narrative and its project. So this whole practice is one of somehow disentangling ourselves from these patterns of behavior, a lot of which are actually rooted in our instinctual biological life. That's simply what we're given at birth. Others, of course, have been built up on that basis by our culture, by our religion, religious beliefs, by our political systems, by our own psychological tendencies, so that rather than letting go of these things, we actually are heavily invested in them. And it takes a while to achieve what we consider the Buddha achieved, of having, as it were, renounced, let go of this way of living, and then resolving to not get caught up in those things and to find another way to live, one in which we are consciously and caringly responding to life rather than being effectively driven reactively to perpetuate the same patterns that drive us. So what these 32 dimensions of awakening present us with is a complete template for understanding the Dharma and putting it into practice. And this template of these 32 factors correlated to these 4 paths and these 4 tasks is all we need to know about the practice of the Dharma. This is enough. We're not required to commit ourselves to any particular metaphysical beliefs. We could, I mean, it's a free choice to do that if you wish, but I think what this is pointing to is that on this template, on this framework, we have an outline, a kind of a roadmap that will enable us to practice the Dharma completely. We don't need anything else. And this would imply that this kind of template could adapt itself to pretty much any worldview, whether it's the worldview of ancient India that the Buddhists adopted and then further developed, in fact, in their own philosophies and doctrines, or whether it's a secular, humanist, liberal worldview like the one probably most of us share. In other words, the worldviews, the metaphysics, the big picture has actually got really nothing to do with the practice of the Dharma. And I think we get a very good, I can make, I think, a good case for this by citing quite a famous passage of the Buddha where he says, I do not dispute with the world. I've got no argument with the world. The world, however, argues with me. Whatever the wise in the world agree upon as existing, I too say it exists. And whatever the wise in the world agree does not exist, I too agree that it exists, does not exist. This is a very powerful statement. And it is effectively saying that the Buddha is effectively saying, I'm not interested actually in the nature of reality, of how the world evolved in the way it did in physics, biology, chemistry. These things do not actually concern what I'm teaching. What I'm teaching is how to live in this world in an optimal way, not how to arrive at a final definitive understanding of what reality is or what particularly what ultimate reality is. It's quite striking that although every school of Buddhism, Theravada, Tibetan, Zen, Mahayana, Vajrayana, all are rooted in a doctrine of two truths, ultimate truth and conventional or relative truth. And the awakened person is the one who has awoken to the nature of ultimate truth. That is what frees the mind from ignorance. That is what grants enlightenment. I don't think that way at all. There's nowhere in the Pali Canon, in the early discourses of the Buddha, or in the early translations of texts that only survive in Chinese, nowhere does the Buddha claim to understand or know ultimate truth. He doesn't even use that word. This ultimate truth, relative truth thing came in at a later date. It's completely absent in the early discourses. And it's not as though he speaks of that in a slightly different way. That whole perspective that somehow Buddhism is about accessing ultimate truth is just not on the agenda. It's not on the table. It's completely alien to the early teachings. And I think what happened over time is that Buddhism took an epistemological turn, eine erkenntnistheoretischen Kehre. Would that be correct? And it switched from being essentially a practice of ethics, how to live, into a set of truth claims that you then had to know by refining your awareness and gaining deep non-conceptual insight into reality. And much Buddhist language today assumes that to be the case. That's what the practice is about. So what we're doing here in this secular approach to the Dharma is returning back to what I feel, again, my own judgment, as to what the original template might have looked like. And I've come up with this model here. So the second part of this process is that of unification. So the first path is about formation or Bildung. It's about mindfulness. It's about resolve. It's about creativity. It's about establishing one's understanding of the world, establishing one's purpose, and cultivating the capacity to think imaginatively and creatively in what one does. The second path, unification, is far more about working with our own mental, spiritual condition in a formal way. And it's this that then leads to a feeling of somehow being unified, integrated in one's life in such a way that we can, as it were, sharpen or make more powerful the practices that we do. Unification in Sanskrit is a prayoga. So as you can see, it uses the word yoga. This is the practice, basically, of yoga in a Buddhist sense. Yoga, of course, means to yoke, to bring into union. Yoga is literally about unification. And pra-yoga, pra is an intensifier, and it seems to me translates quite well as unification. So union becomes unification. The bringing together the capacities, the strengths we have to help us tread this path. And so this process of letting go being this second task, is enabled by what are called 5 faculties. In some translations, they say 5 strengths. But either way, the word suggests a kind of power. The word faculty is indriya in Pali. And indriya, we have the 5 indriya, are the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind, actually 6 indriya. And these faculties, as we would translate it, quite more literally mean powers. When the Tibetans translated indriya, they became wangbul, which wang means power. So the faculties, the senses, are understood as powers or strengths. And there are 5 of them that are brought together as the means of our practice of yoga. And in this idea, it's a practice that involves letting go of these reactive patterns in such a way that they bring our consciousness into a greater kind of unity and purpose. So I'm going to go through these 5, but I'm going to focus to a large extent upon the first one, faith. Now, here we might feel, now we're actually going to have a problem because this is supposed to be a secular approach to the Dharma, and now we're talking about faith. The easy way around that problem would be to say, well, it doesn't really mean faith, it means confidence or trust. Vertrauen, I think, is the way the German speakers get around it. Instead of Glauben, you have Vertrauen. And I can see the case for that. I think confidence and trust are perfectly good translations of this term, but frankly, I'm very reluctant to lose the word faith. I think faith is a very beautiful idea, and one that's, again, connected to an experience of depth that notions like confidence and trust don't quite do it. Of course, the problem with it is that it's so closely associated with religious faith. So when we say a person of faith, we think of a very devout Christian or Hindu or Buddhist. But again, I think that's a fairly superficial use of the word faith. But let's try and stick with the word faith and see if we can get a deeper sense of what it means for those of us who don't consider ourselves to be religious, to belong to a religious tradition, or to identify as a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever. Now, one of the people who has been very helpful in my own thinking is the Protestant theologian Paul Tilley, who started his work here in Germany, and then in the early 30s, he went to America to escape the Nazis and spent the rest of his life in Chicago as a professor of theology. And he was quite a radical thinker. He took a lot of the work of the philosophers like Heidegger and Sartre and others, and he used that existentialist philosophy as a way to try to find another language for his faith. And faith became, for Tilley, what he calls ultimate concern. He says faith is not about believing in something or believing in God. Faith is a way of talking about what matters ultimately to me, what is non-negotiable in my life. So when we did this meditation after the talk this morning, the reflection on death, you're left with the question, if death is certain, its time is uncertain, then what should I do? And I phrased it also as, what matters most for me? And that is your faith. What matters most to you when you really dig deeply into who you are? What is really most important? For Tilley, that is the way to understand faith. And whether you are a believer or a non-believer, you still have ultimate passions and concerns that you will never betray, things that you would never speak against, things that you will always be true to, values like love, compassion, wisdom, or it might be democracy or freedom of speech. You can be passionately and ultimately committed to those concerns, and that's your faith. I think we get a sense of this of faith when we look at the actual structure of the path itself. Remember, it seems a long time ago now, but 2 days ago, on the first talk, we started by looking at the path as a metaphor that implies three things. A path has a destination. A path is an emptiness in that it allows a space in which you can move freely towards the destination. And a path is an expression of a community of people and animals other than you, those that have made the path by the tread of their feet, and in your treading the path, you keep it open for those who will come after you. Now, if we turn that very slightly through the lens of Buddhism, it turns out that these are essentially the three refuges. That the Buddha is the destination or awakening. Being awake is the destination. Moving freely without obstacle or hindrance is the practice of the Dharma. And participating in a path that is created by and is dedicated to others who will follow you, that is the Sangha, that is the community. So Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the sort of core elements of Buddhist faith, could be understood quite easily as simply ways of articulating that threefold complexity of walking on a path with a destination, with a process of movement, and with a community that is both supporting us and we are supporting them. So the Buddha has a curious term, which is also translated as faith. It's avecca passado. Passado means to be luminous or clear or bright, and avecca means sort of without, with unwavering, without moving, without. In other words, it's a constant inner clarity. And this is understood as a kind of faith. So the person who enters the stream of the Eightfold Path becomes, on the one hand, autonomous in their practice, as I mentioned yesterday, but also such a person achieves what's called avecca passado, lucid confidence in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, or lucid confidence in the project itself of leading one's life towards the goal of being awake, committing oneself to walking the path, and doing so in the framework of others who are committed to the same goal. So autonomy, being independent of others, does not conflict with having lucid confidence in the community that supports you. They're both necessary. It's not an either or kind of question. So I think in this way we can see that we've moved a long way from the idea that faith means believing things that are impossible to believe. A person of faith is a bit gullible and a bit kind of naive and so on, and they have all kinds of strange beliefs. That's a very superficial understanding of what faith is about. Another source that I found very helpful in my understanding of faith is from a text called the Milinda Punha, The Questions of King Milinda. Milinda is the Pali pronunciation of the Greek word Mananda. Northwest India, Gandhara, where Arif is from, was once ruled by the Greeks. After the invasions, after Alexander's army arrived in India, it actually arrived in Taxila. We mentioned that. It didn't get any further than the Indus Valley. But after Alexander went back, well, he died in Babylon, but his empire, the Hellenistic empire that he set up, was then governed by his generals and other supporters. And over time, probably about a couple of hundred years after Alexander, we know of what's called an Indo-Greek king called Menander. And Menander was very interested in Buddhism. And he had a dialogue with a Buddhist monk called Nagasena. And this dialogue is recorded. And it appears in the Pali Canon. There's a Sanskrit version as well. And it's a very fascinating text because it's basically an East-West dialogue, probably the first ever, where you have a Greek asking a Buddhist monk, Indian, about the Dharma, basically. And it's kind of like, it's a sort of basic question-answer format. So Menander says, Nagasena, how would you define faith? And this is Nagasena's answer. A faith has two characteristics: clarification and leaping, clarity and jumping. And so he doesn't give a definition, as later Buddhist traditions, try to give exact psychological definitions of these terms. Nagasena thinks in terms of images. His is more an imaginary approach. He says, imagine a great king who crosses a stream with an army of horses and soldiers and so forth, and they stop in the middle of the stream, and they are looking for some water to drink. But the water around them is all muddy and messy and so on, and so they can't drink, the water they're standing in. And so someone comes along who has a magic jewel, and he put the magic jewel in the water, and it becomes clear suddenly. It's like a water purifying tablet, we might say, or something similar. We don't have to believe in all that stuff. But the point of the metaphor is that by purifying the water, it becomes clear and still. And so Nagasena says, faith is like this kind of jewel, like this water purifying tablet. It clarifies the mind of reactivity and renders it clear, pure, and serene. So faith and this is not just here, but also in this word passado, which I just mentioned, also means lucidity. In this way of thinking about faith, we're moving quite far from our Western understanding of the term. You find it in Tibetan Buddhism too. Faith is defined as a kind of innate clarity of mind. So it's the capacity Faith is, in that sense, something that occurs in moments where we suddenly have a new sense of what our life is like. It's moments of sudden insight that illuminate what is unclear and give us the sense that there's something possible within my life that has been revealed, and that gives me the confidence to reveal it. Now, this clarity, I think, is obviously connected here to the absence of reactivity, the letting go of reactivity, the stopping of reactivity. And in that moment of stopping, even if it's only for 2 seconds, there is a clear, radiant space that opens up. Non-reactivity is like this clear and radiant space. And that is what you have faith in. That you have the faith that even though you're caught up and entangled in all these anxieties and thoughts and worries and so on, you have had the experience and you intuitively know that there is a non-reactive possibility within you. And you could live from that space rather than the reactive space. And then the other image that we find with Nagasena is the idea of leaping. That means to jump. And here's the example he gives. He says, imagine a crowd of people who arrive at the bank of a river that has been swollen by a violent storm, who are afraid of the width of the river and the depth of the water, and they hesitate to cross. But then a man appears who, knowing his own capacity and power, takes a great leap which safely brings him to the other bank. Then the people too will leap. Likewise, when one recognizes that the minds of others are freed, does one find the faith to leap towards such a state oneself. So this has to do that faith is very often inspired by the example of other people. This has certainly been true for me. Figures, particularly in my Buddhist career, like the Dalai Lama and my own teachers, my Zen teacher, and many others. These are people who live lives that are exemplary. And I'm not necessarily most impressed by what they say and what they tell me to do and so on. I might actually disagree with some of that. But what I remain constantly moved by is how these people's lives are driven by a deep faith. And I don't think of that even as having to be religious faith, but a person of deep principle and conviction, we might say, is a person of faith. And I'm sure if we think through our own lives, people we've met who've had an inspirational role. And sometimes I can remember having met someone once or twice, quite briefly, a teacher maybe, yet something about that encounter, it might have been what they said, but probably it was more to do with the way they basically embodied what they believed in. And that serves as an inspiration, as an example, that I could also try to live like that. That doesn't mean that I just repeat the same things that they say and believe the same things as them, but it's about aspiring to a life of greater integrity, unification, wisdom, and so forth. Now, of course, For many of us here in Western Europe, when we hear of faith and we hear of leaping, we think of Søren Kierkegaard, who famously spoke of the leap of faith. This is, I mean, I'm not a great expert on Kierkegaard at all, but it's very difficult not to be aware of his idea of the leap of faith. It's even entered into common language now. I know you might find this difficult to believe, but you've got to make a leap of faith and trust me. Something like that in English. So why did Kierkegaard think of faith as a leap? I think probably because he realized that this leap, or this choice that we make, this existential choice we make, cannot be arrived at just by a kind of intellectual calculation. Well, I should have faith in the Buddha because this text seems to make a lot of sense. And I've had it explained to me that emptiness is the nature of reality. It all makes sense. Yeah, I'm going to believe in all that. Faith, that's a very superficial kind of faith. Faith in its depths has to do with making a choice that cannot be reduced just to an intellectual preference. And it's therefore somehow rooted in something deeper, what we might call intuition, actually, or chitta, soul, heart, however we translate that. So hopefully, as we've been looking at faith here, and I'm going to get onto the other factors too, but faith is the one that really stands out for me here. It's also the first. It's the first on the list, and I think that's also probably significant. It also leads me to think of a book that I read a couple of years ago by Martin Hägglund. Have you heard of him? He's a Swedish philosopher working in Yale University. And he published a book called This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. Now, for Hägglund, faith is quite explicitly not just of a religious kind. In fact, the first half of his book is his understanding, his reflections on secular faith. So as a secular Buddhist, I found this very interesting. It's a fantastic book, by the way. I suspect it's in German, but you could also get it in English. So I'm not going to go into any detail of Hägglund's arguments and so on, but just to give you a glimpse of how he understands secular faith. The most fundamental form of secular faith, he says, is the faith that life is worth living. The faith that life is worth living. It's the faith, and to embrace this kind of faith is to be devoted to a life that will end, to be dedicated to projects that can fail and break down. So in other words, this kind of faith is a recognition that what we care about most deeply, what our ultimate concerns are, that life is worth living and that life must go on, is therefore something that inevitably perhaps will cause us grief and pain. If our faith is in something that will break down, that will die, rather than something eternal like God, then we are committing ourselves to work with situations that are imperfect and that might fail, and we might also fail in our attempts to achieve them. Now, I hadn't thought of this before, but your question this morning about these vows, I think actually gives another insight into these vows, that suffering is endless, but I vow to end it. I'm committed to the project of preserving life and so on, but I may fail personally in that project. And that doesn't actually matter. The important point is that we are able to give ourselves totally to the survival of life on earth. Now, the religious conception of faith, at least for Martin Hägglund, is the complete opposite of that. The religious conception of faith is to have faith in something that can never let you down, that can never fail you. So to have religious faith, explains Hägglund, is to disown our secular faith in a fragile form of life, because religious faith holds that our ultimate aim should be to transcend the limitations, the finitude that we share on earth. So what unites the faiths of the world's religions is not belief in a personal or an impersonal God, but the ideal of a peaceful state of eternity, where you are liberated from the risk of losing what you love. So for Hägglund, the Buddhist goal of nirvana, traditional Buddhist goal of nirvana, where one is freed forever from birth and death, is a clear and consistent example of the religious ideal of eternity. But the problem, as if one actually achieved, let's say, Christian salvation in eternity with God, or Buddhist liberation, eternity in nirvana, then nothing really would matter much anymore about what goes on earth. You no longer identify with that. You no longer care about it. You're in your eternal blissed out state. So for me, the faith that drives my practice is not a religious faith in which my goal is some kind of permanent final enlightenment or liberation or nirvana or heaven or pure lands or whatever. But it's a faith that is committed to an unconditional love of life itself, in all of its messiness, in all of its tragedy, in all of its imperfection, in all of its brutality. The fact of life itself is what I am committed to, in a sense. And in this way, mindfulness, energy, wisdom, and focus, which are the other four of these five powers, are basically helping us to sustain that kind of faith. Hägglund also points out that the current ecological crisis can only be taken seriously from a standpoint of secular faith. If you believe in rebirth, for example, that after death everybody's going to get reborn somewhere else according to their karma, then in one way it doesn't really matter if the world goes up in a nuclear explosion or is destroyed by climate change, because everyone's going to get born again anyway. Or if you're a Christian, your eternal soul will wander off into some nicer place. So this world is really not of ultimate significance for you. It's just a temporary kind of landing spot we happen to be in now, where we can transition on to eternity if we're good Christians or Buddhists or Jews or Hindus or Muslims. But that's not what this secular approach is at all interested in. So let's just look, before we conclude, with these supportive factors, and to try to see how this works in terms of letting go of reactivity. We've already looked at mindfulness enough that I don't really need to go into that, but the mindfulness that would be appropriate in this particular path of unification would be bearing in mind the importance of letting go of reactivity. So when we're meditating, for example, and we suddenly get caught up in a cycle of worry about something, then if we gently remember to let go, just to say to ourselves, okay, let go of that that's reactivity, I accept it for what it is, but I'm not going to get caught up in it. So to be constantly mindful of the notion of letting go, not though letting go as a kind of pushing away. This is the trouble. You know, we get we feel, say, anxious or something, and we say, yes, I must let go of my anxiety. But what I really mean is, I wish this would just go away. I can't stand this. So I'll let it go as a good Buddhist. I think even the word letting go might be too loaded, because letting go still implies that you're doing something. The usual translation, by the way, of this word is abandon. You must abandon reactivity, which for me is way too strong. It implies literally pushing it away, getting rid of it, stamping it out. But in the practice of mindfulness, that's exactly what you don't do. In the practice of mindfulness, we say, just let it go. But if you think about it, it might even be better to say, let it be. Let it be. I got anxious thoughts. Well, let them be. Because if I let them be, and this is what letting go really means, if I let them be and I don't reinforce them, I don't fight against them, then over time they will fade away anyway, because they're impermanent. That's their nature. They're not going to hang around unless I make an issue out of it and charge them up, which makes them worse, of course, or try to suppress them, and then they'll come out in some other form. So letting go is, in a way, letting be. And again, you have this beautiful German word, Gelassenheit. And it doesn't translate into English, really. But I think that this letting go is actually about Gelassenheit. Heidegger, as you know, wrote a short book called Gelassenheit. It's marvelous. So what we're mindful of in this phase of the practice is this mindfulness just to leave things alone. Let them be. Don't affirm them, don't deny them. Just let them be. Again, very easy to say, very difficult to do. So that would be the mindfulness. The energy, the effort we make, I think we've really already covered that. We don't need to look into that here. And then we come to wisdom. Panya, prajna, wisdom. And again, it's tempting, as with the word faith, to try to find a more secular term. Let's say discernment is actually quite literally kind of what it means in some ways. Discernment. Wisdom is a bit vague, but again, I think it's a very powerful word that we should not, get rid of, but try to infuse it with another life in the way that we could perhaps do so with faith. But wisdom in the Buddhist traditions does imply the capacity to make distinctions, to differentiate, to discern something. And it's important in this process precisely because it's not always easy to know whether what's rising up is just habitual reactivity or something else. We can be easily tricked by the play of our own mind. We can be tricked by some of the things our mind tells us too. So wisdom or discernment is about becoming much more attuned to recognizing what it is that is to be let go of or to be let be, and what it is that is to be cultivated. And this again is, we're moving ahead a bit into the fourth task of cultivation. But basically, when we're sitting in meditation, and the example that was it you or someone on the screen had about, I'm sitting in meditation and then this lovely poem comes up. Do I cultivate the poem or do I let the poem go? That's basically the choice we're faced with. And that choice is essentially one of discernment, of wisdom. And in training wisdom and training discernment, we're really training ourselves to make better judgments. And as we become more autonomous in our practice, we develop the capacity to refine the process of making judgments. So in other words, it doesn't help for me to say, if you have a line of a poem come up in meditation, then it is wrong to follow it. Don't do that. It's up to you to decide. It's entirely up to you. But that needs to be a reasoned and hopefully serious reflection on what you're doing. You take this judgment seriously. But that's where wisdom comes to play here. It's in getting a finer attunement as to our sensitivity of what's arising within us and making the choice to let something just be, if it's going to be disturbing or destructive. And if we notice something rising up in us like kindness or generosity, then of course we cultivate that. We let that flourish. We let that grow. So in this practice of unification, we are creating the crucible, the vessel in which this process of letting reactivity be can be deepened and developed. But we're also developing the discernment to distinguish between what is to be let go of, second task, and what is to be cultivated, fourth task. What is to be cultivated is the Eightfold Path. So that's kind of all I need to say about this, I think. I'm slightly concerned that I'm overloading you with information. Is that correct? Yes. Yes, you see. Yes, someone at least is honest in this room. Well, in that case, hopefully you're very satisfied. But I realize that there is a lot of material here, and but I do feel it is worthwhile to try to sketch over this period of 3 days the whole picture. That's what I'm trying to do. And I apologize if it's too much, but you can listen to the talks again. You can read other stuff I've written if you want to revisit some of this material later. So now we have time for our groups, our small groups, and those of you online, you will be sent to your breakout rooms. You'll be randomly distributed. Saskia's already at work on that, are you? Or, well, in a minute, let me just finish what I'm going to say. And in this room, I'll break you up into groups too, unless someone else would like to do that. The problem is I want to mix you up as much as possible, so you're not the same group as yesterday. And my idea would be just to count in a different way. But that should work, shouldn't it? But I've done this before, and by some bizarre magic, the same groups ended up in the... Okay, so we're going to be 4 groups of 5 people. So 1, 2, 3, 4. You were in, okay, we'll start here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's easy. And, oh, I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Okay? Is that going to work? So there'll be 2 groups of ist das klar? You neither. I started with him. Oh, well, there you go. I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. That should make it even. And if it doesn't work out as I planned, just go and sit with one of the groups in the dining room and enjoy the conversation. The subject. Well, we've covered so much today. I'd like us to either explore what we mean by or understand by creativity, but by giving concrete examples, not just abstract definitions. And likewise with faith. If you could focus on creativity and faith, but try to find examples of faith in your own life, rather than some idea of what it might be.